Thank you so much. I am very excited to be here with everybody today, and our session will include information about how dyslexia is included in special education, important features about the science of reading, types of assessments that are often used in school-based practices, key questions for educators to consider, and certainly there'll be time for some of your questions as well. I'll start with an overview of how dyslexia fits into special education regulations. And there are many different parts of this. I just want to kick off with a definition of dyslexia. And notice that this definition that you see on the slide, which comes from the International Dyslexia Association, specifically indicates that it is a type of specific learning disability, that it's neurobiological in origin. And the one of the key pieces to understand is that it is primarily a deficit in aspects of phonological encoding. And that's the thing that makes it difficult for individuals with dyslexia to learn to read. They can learn to read, it's simply a matter of what instruction is necessary. So, how does this fit within special education? Well, in the United States, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and it is our law that requires providing education for all students, regardless of ability or disability. And thus, all US states are required to take the federal guidelines, build their own state laws, and deliver a free, appropriate public education for all children, including those with disabilities. Our law includes 13 specific different types of disability that are covered under this law, and one of those is called specific learning disability. Now, it's the case that dyslexia is not one of the 13. However, it is included within the category of specific learning disability. And our Office of Special Education Programs has reminded states and school districts that dyslexia is indeed covered within the context of this thing called an SLD. Here you can see from the actual regulations that specific learning disability is defined here, and within that definition, dyslexia is clearly covered. Another piece to know about, because we'll touch on this in the course of our session today, is that if a school, any personnel at the school suspect that a student is displaying any type of disability, there is a responsibility to conduct an evaluation. And this is true if there's a suspicion of dyslexia. This evaluation is multidisciplinary. And in the case of a specific learning disability, there are some additional provisions in the law. And one of these is that a type of data that can be used in considering whether or not a student indeed has a specific learning disability are data indicating how a child responds to scientific research-based intervention. And so we'll come back and share information about what that would look like in the case of conducting assessments of students suspected of dyslexia. There are a few other things I think it's important for us to keep in mind as we consider what is dyslexia and how can we best support students with dyslexia. First of all, it's a condition that manifests along a continuum. There isn't just one type or one look to dyslexia. Some students will have a very mild presentation, others it will be much more severe. But the thing to realize is that almost everyone with dyslexia can learn to read, and most students with dyslexia will participate in the general education classroom for most of their instruction. And so it's a matter of really appreciating what types of specialized instruction a student with dyslexia requires, and then providing those in addition to other parts of their learning experience in school each day. Another big thing to be aware of is the earlier that we recognize potential signs of dyslexia and provide intervention, the better the outcomes for the student. So early Early intervention really, really matters. Finally, another piece about understanding effective supports for dyslexia is to take into account how that can work within a multi-tiered system of support. This, of course, is an area in which I have written a great deal and spoken a great deal and is dear to my heart. And our presentation is going to be situating approaches to supporting students with dyslexia within a three-tiered model and recognizing that the most effective supports will start with tier one core instruction, and that it is how we layer on tier two strategic supplemental instruction, as well as any necessary intensive intervention that will make the difference for students with dyslexia. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Laura, who's going to share with us information about the science of reading.
Hello, everyone. In this next section, I'm going to be sharing briefly about what we know from science of reading research. This certainly began long before the U.S. National Reading Panel in 2000, but that really brought us together, recognizing that there are 5 essential elements for effective reading instruction: phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Just after that, soon after that, Hollis Scarborough developed this metaphor. She kind of quickly drew and then ended up publishing these strands of a woven rope to describe these elements of reading. She expanded a little bit on the 5 areas to talk about components related to language comprehension that we see on the top of this drawing. Vocabulary and comprehension or oral language comprehension being the essential pieces of this, but also recognizing the importance of background knowledge, recognizing the importance of grammar and syntax and the language structures that we have, reasoning skills like inferencing, and then certainly we're starting to see even more importance around text structures, genres, and understanding the structures in which our language is and our written language is created. At the bottom of this graphic, right, is the word recognition strands, where we see the phonological awareness, the phonics, the decoding, the encoding, and our sight word knowledge. All of these come together. These strands are woven together, building automaticity and strategicness to be a fluent reader. Fluent reading leads us to skilled reading, in which we're bringing together what we know about comprehension and what we know to be able to recognize words, to be able to understand what we're reading. For children with dyslexia, the difficulty is in the strands reflected by word recognition. Difficulty with phonemic awareness, slower to learn to decode and encode or spell, and to bring it together as a fluent reader. Some signs you might see of dyslexia. Early on, you're going to see some difficulty identifying sounds, associating the letters with the sounds, blending and segmenting words together, sounding out words like hat and mat. By the middle grades, we often see that students are reading more slowly, or they're starting to avoid reading out loud, having difficulty sounding out multisyllabic words. Spelling tends to be an ongoing sign. This can also lead to students to write less, depending upon how their teachers are responding to them. And by secondary, we continue to see similar signs, depending upon if students have gotten good instruction and intervention. But difficulty with multisyllabic words, avoiding written language tasks, finding other ways around things, using some assistive technology, ebooks, hardworking ways to find and learn about pieces. Secondary consequences often show up in reading comprehension because students have had limited fluency and access to those grade level texts along the way. I'm always reminded, and I think it's really important for all of us to recognize that their students usually have very strong oral language, and that's a strength that we want to build on. So, what do we mean when we're saying what is really good instruction? What is the science of reading saying about instruction? So, this is built on this comprehensive tier 1, where we see literacy instruction across all the strands of the ropes, where we see instruction that is structured literacy. We're going to talk about what is structured literacy in just a moment. Where we see that we have a comprehensive assessment system so that we can differentiate our instruction to meet the needs of students at all different levels and areas of strength, and that we can provide supports in a universal manner, right? To think about universally designing our instruction so all students have access to it, and that we have teachers who are trained in reading science. So all of these things make up this foundation that we want to see in our reading instruction. So I'm going to take a brief moment to talk a little bit about structured literacy and the kinds of instruction that are involved. First of all, it's described as systematic and cumulative, that it includes an explicit instruction, diagnostic teaching, in addressing all elements of language. So what do we mean by systematic and cumulative? So here we're seeing that we're building on skills from the easier to more difficult. We're using a consistent scope and sequence, and we're working towards mastery. So you can see on these little green sticky notes, right? So ideas of what this would look like for kindergarten and first grade, right? That we're going to progress through all of the phonemes of the language or languages that we're teaching. We're going to talk about how to map those sounds to the letters and the letter patterns using a consistent scope and sequence. We're going to also continue to think about this, right? Identifying sounds at the beginning, the end, and the middle of words. We're going to blend and we're going to segment 2 really key phonemic awareness activities. We're going to then map those sounds onto the letter patterns. Once we're starting to decode those words, we want to practice reading them in decodable texts, making sure that our students are understanding what they're reading along the way. And we want to see an increase in accuracy and automaticity as they're reading words, phrases, and passages, working towards fluent reading. We do this using an explicit instruction model where we model a lot, right? Sound letter correspondences. We are looking for lots of student engagement, opportunities for students to respond and practice and receive immediate corrective feedback as they're reading. Just going to take a moment to let you read the screen. I'm not going to read it to you, just to give you a little bit of a glimpse of what a dialogue might be between a teacher, T, and an S, student. One of the next components, right, of structured literacy is diagnostic teaching. What we're talking about here is using formative assessment to monitor student performance within and across lessons to make those individual adjustments that might be necessary. So we might have a student we see that's really struggling with segmenting or articulating that final sound within a word. And we might want to add some instruction that really attends to the articulatory gestures, how the sounds are made in our mouths. or we're monitoring and we're realizing that a student's accuracy or automaticity is not increasing. And we're going to do a little bit more diagnostic work. We're going to check into those underlying phonemic awareness skills. We might add additional multisensory approaches to support the student's learning. And we're going to review and practice and recognize, did we teach some of the skills that we were doing to mastery? We may also, think about how we need to differentiate and work with our multilingual learners, helping them contrast the phonemes in the languages in their linguistic repertoires. And of course, make sure that we're doing a quick check for meaning. Sometimes our instruction is more complicated than what we're trying to have them read. And that can be why they're struggling on these assessments. So to summarize a little bit about structured literacy, it is more than phonemic awareness and phonics. Sometimes that's where people think that's what we're talking about, but it really is all of the elements of language, and it should be incorporated into literacy instruction. Thinking about those upper strands in Scarborough's rope and the lower strands. For example, we're going to be teaching affixes and roots. We're going to teach systematically strategies to identify text structures. We want to develop word consciousness across disciplines as students learn academic vocabulary. We're going to teach syllable types to help students decode and spell multisyllabic words. And during writing instruction, we're going to incorporate teaching of syntactic structures to expand their sentence structure. And we're going to use read alouds of text sets to build background knowledge about the world. So with that, thinking about instruction, Rachel's now going to share a little bit about assessment.
Thank you, Laura. So now we're going to learn about some of the assessments that can be useful in identifying whether a student's at risk for dyslexia and what additional data you might need in order to move something to the level of a comprehensive evaluation for special education. So there are 4 types of assessments that I'm going to share with you that could play a role in the process of identifying potential reading problems all the way through identifying that a student indeed has dyslexia and qualifies for special education. And these are screening, diagnostic assessment, progress monitoring, and a comprehensive evaluation. Screening is a type of assessment that's typically done 3 times a year with all students. It's also sometimes called universal screening because we want all students to participate in these brief assessments. These assessments are designed to provide information for teachers about the strength of the core instruction. In other words, what percentage of students are meeting learning targets based on those screening data? And are most students reaching the learning goals, or are many not reaching the learning goals? That information can give us an idea of whether or not our Tier 1 core instruction is at the strength or level it needs to be to meet the needs of most students. Screening data can also provide information about which students are struggling the most and might need additional support. And so it will highlight those students whose scores are substantially below the expectation so that we can look for ways to support these students in addition to any changes we might make in our core instruction. Importantly, screening data are not sufficient on their own in order to make all conclusions about a student or to identify dyslexia. But they are a very helpful first step. Then teachers can move on to gather some additional data and figure out the why of a student's difficulty. I often will say that screening data will tell us that students are struggling, but not necessarily the why of their struggles. Diagnostic assessment, however, helps to inform the why. Why is it that a student is not making effective progress toward becoming a reader? And in that regard, it provides a bridge from screening to intervention. Diagnostic assessment is typically done after screening for students who have very low scores so that the teacher can learn more about what it is the student can do right now. Effective instruction needs to build on what the student can do. And so these types of diagnostic assessments are going to be able to provide more details about where the student's gaps are, what they do know, and what kind of additional instruction the student needs in order to make effective reading progress. For those students who do need supplemental intervention in order to make effective progress, we always recommend progress monitoring. Progress monitoring is a type of assessment that's typically done on a weekly basis and is a brief assessment that will give us data about whether or not the intervention is working. The progress measure needs to be matched to the particular skill of the intervention so that it is sensitive to the student's growth over time. And importantly, progress data will help us to know whether or not a student has responded to the intervention. This connects with that component of special education rules that I mentioned earlier, where we are allowed to use progress data collected during intervention as a component of documenting whether or not a student meets the criteria for dyslexia and a specific learning disability. And when we're looking at such data, typically what we are going to see for a student who indeed presents with dyslexia is that the student does not make effective progress in supplemental intervention provided with fidelity in the way that a typically developing reader would. Because dyslexia is characterized by very slow progress toward reading. And so when we have these data that show that a student can improve, but improves more slowly than normal, it definitely could mean that dyslexia is present. And in that regard, we can use these data as part of a comprehensive evaluation. The fourth type of assessment information is that comprehensive evaluation. This is where we gather all the information available about the student to look carefully at the reading profile and also examine what kinds of instruction and intervention have been provided for the student. It's important that we rule out that the student's reading problems are not caused by a lack of effective instruction. That indeed is a requirement within the special education rules. However, we need to pause and think carefully about whether or not all the data available are consistent in reflecting a student who manifests the core phonological challenges that are consistent with dyslexia, as well as slow progress toward learning to read. Because when that is the case and the team confirms that dyslexia is present, the next question is, does this student need specialized instruction in order to make effective progress in school? That's another required question that needs to be asked by a team before making a decision about special education eligibility. Now I'll hand it back to Laura, who's going to share some ideas about key questions in identifying dyslexia as an SLD in schools.
Thank you, Rachel. To follow up a little bit on what we've been saying, there are three key questions when we think about dyslexia and school-based identification. First of all, to remind you back to the beginning, dyslexia is a specific learning disability in basic reading. And so what we're looking for when we're making an identification in schools is the answers to these three questions. One, does the student demonstrate low achievement in academic domains? 2, does the student show insufficient response to effective reading instruction and interventions? And 3, has the team considered other factors that might contribute or explain the reading difficulty that is being identified? So what does this mean specifically when we think about a learning disability in basic reading or dyslexia? So when looking over a series of assessments and records and information that we have gathered through our comprehensive assessment system, these are the kinds of things that we would see in a child with dyslexia. So they would have some, maybe not all of these, but many of them. Low achievement in word reading, low achievement in decoding and or reading of non-words, spelling. Their reading fluency would be slower, both in terms of reading individual words and reading connected text. That they would have difficulty in phonemic awareness, that is being able to identify, blend, and segment sounds separate from the letters. That they frequently will have shorter, less developed auditory short-term memory, and that they respond to or name letters, sounds, numbers slower, rapid automatized naming. In addition, students would be showing insufficient response to effective reading intervention. So what would we see there? We would see limited progress on reading curriculum-based measures. In the kindergarten and first grade, that might be on a phonemic segmentation fluency measure. In first, second, third grade, we might be seeing that on our reading CBM. We would see inconsistent or slow mastery of phonics patterns, perhaps through a phonics survey that's been given monthly across some time in kindergarten or first grade. And we would see in the records that they regularly participated in literacy instruction that incorporated structured literacy. And then the team needs to consider and rule out exclusionary factors. Here, remember, I was saying we're thinking about what could cause a difficulty with reading. And that certainly could be a specific learning disability or dyslexia in reading, but it can be other things. And here we're not talking really about tests. We're really thinking about who is the whole child. We're going to review those records carefully and see what's there. We're going to engage with family members, very much a part of the team as we think about special education, children's growth, development. We're going to consult with our colleagues across expertise. Frequently, we might bring in a speech-language pathologist, talk to the reading specialist who's been providing the reading intervention, perhaps. Maybe we want to talk to a social worker. Maybe there's other things that are factoring. Perhaps our child is a multilingual learner and we want to know more about what's been going on in their language classes. We're going to do some observations across settings. And we may need to do some additional assessments, but not always. And one of the big questions here often becomes, what about an IQ test? It's not necessary. It's only necessary if the team has a question about whether the student has an intellectual disability. Our previous models of specific learning disability required an IQ test, but currently that is not the case. And research has shown that IQ tests are not reliable predictors of SLD and frequently show some biases. IQ test scores are confounded with these achievement scores. And so in and of themselves, they are not helpful for a diagnosis of specific learning disability. So as we think about dyslexia and we think about some of the things that we have talked about today, we really want to think about a comprehensive program, building on that tier 1 foundation with structured literacy, with systematic instruction across all strands of the reading rope. We want to think about interventions and intensive interventions that might be necessary for students that have more significant reading difficulties, that leads to perhaps the need for daily intensive structured literacy instruction. Students here also might need some multidisciplinary supports, working with all different professionals that we have in our school systems, between reading, special education, speech and language, counseling, to think about the whole child, to think about all of what a child might need in their educational program. And we want to make sure that we're using comprehensive assessment system and monitoring frequently for success. And if we're not seeing success, that we're going to review our program, make some adjustments, change the supports, and intensify the instruction so that we know that all children can read successfully.
First, thank you both so much. It's been super information packed, and there's lots of great guidance that we can start using right away to help reduce the struggle for students with dyslexia. All right. So we did have some great questions came in from the audience, and let's get started. So question 1, what's the difference in commonality in dyslexia and Erland syndrome?
I confess I am not aware of Erland syndrome. I would need more information to be able to answer that question. Laura?
So Erland syndrome is, from what I know, is connected to a difficulty with vision. And so dyslexia is not related to vision. Dyslexia is based in difficulty with the sound system of our language. And so while children may have some difficulty with vision, and certainly that should be checked out, dyslexia and Erland syndrome are not the same thing.
All righty. Thank you. Next question. Are private schools also required to assess?
Yes, they are. There are a number of facets to the way that students with disabilities are identified. And so the pathway for a student who's enrolled in a private school could vary in relation to who made the decision for the child to be at that school, as well as the types of supports that may have been provided in the past or needed in the future. What I can say is that the student's home school district holds the responsibility for assisting that child in accessing a free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And thus, if you have questions about the needs or education of a student who's enrolled in a private school, the thing to do would be to contact the special education office at the child's home school district. In other words, the school in which the student would otherwise attend, the public school that the child would otherwise attend.
Excellent. Okay, next question. Should ELs be screened in their native language first?
Yes. I think it's really important that we think of all learners based on the linguistic repertoires that they bring to the table, their home language, their experience with the language of school, if it is different. And we need to recognize that. This is why bringing forward experts in not only reading, but language education is really important. We do know that phonemic awareness, for example, does kind of transition between languages quite well. And in fact, students who are multilingual tend to do better on some of those early phonemic awareness tasks once they have some understanding of all the phonemes, because they have been working on the language and making distinctions between languages that our monolingual learners don't have as much experience with.
Interesting. All right, the questions are rolling in, so we'll get to the next one here. What happened to the whole language movement that used to be all the rage?
Well, I can share that it is still present in certain pockets in this country. And I say that from my experience working with and consulting with schools around the country. I don't think it is necessarily as prevalent as it once was. However, practices associated with the whole language approach remain present. With regard to dyslexia, I will say that that's an approach that does not work well for children with dyslexia, as well as any other type of reading disability, because it is not direct, explicit, systematic, and structured. And so, in situations where whole language is still present, I would strongly encourage coming up with alternatives for children who present with reading difficulties, because they are most likely not going to make effective progress if they don't get that structured literacy instruction.
Um, these are such smart answers, by the way. I never know how to say what a smart answer, but yes. Um, next question. What age or grade level for these instructions or assessments?
So
Well,
across the
go
grade
ahead,
levels,
Laura.
I'll start with instruction, Rachel, and I'll pass the baton to you.
Yeah,
Structured literacy is something that I see across the grade levels, right? Starting in the early kindergarten, in terms of how children are learning language and learning sounds and learning to read. But I also see some, important components of structured literacy all the way through. So thinking about the morphological structure of our language, thinking about the prefixes and the suffixes and the roots and the etymology that's there, is certainly something that we can talk about and address. Children's ability to understand longer and more complex text, writing more complex sentences and text structures that are necessary for opinion writing, for making the understanding of the content that they are learning in other disciplines. So I would say that instructionally, although we focus differently on different strands of the rope as we go through older grade levels, structured literacy is still relevant. Rachel.
absolutely. I agree wholeheartedly with Laura. One of the examples I'd like to give about how structured literacy remains relevant at the secondary level includes content area vocabulary, particularly in science, that will draw down on those phonemic awareness and phonics skills to build up to fluency. And so those long words in the sciences that come from Greek and Latin are ones that benefit from strong foundations in all aspects of literacy and reading. In terms of assessment, my general answer to when should we conduct initial assessments or screenings for dyslexia, early and often. The earlier we identify a student who needs support, the better, the greater the likelihood that we can provide that support effectively and quickly and get the student on track to becoming a reader. So universal screenings 3 times a year in the elementary grades are an excellent way to begin. And then layering on those other assessments as needed for students for whom there are concerns. That's definitely where I'd begin.
Okay, fantastic. All right, next question. We got some good ones here. How would dyslexia impact math abilities?
I can take that one. it great answer. It depends. It's going to depend in relation to, the specific symptomology of the student with dyslexia and where it falls along the continuum. In general, math is distinguished by not having the phonological component that reading and literacy does. So as a result, sometimes mathematics can be much easier for students with dyslexia, and we do see that often. However, mathematics is also a discipline in which access to being able to read is important. And some math curricula incorporate a heavy load of reading, which can then be very challenging for children with dyslexia and other reading problems. And then, unfortunately, we see kids who will start to shut down on math because they think they cannot do the mathematics because of the presence of all those words that are preventing them from really accessing what is the mathematical problem at hand. And so something to think about for children with dyslexia is what kind of math instruction is being provided. Is it word heavy, and are there ways to make it less word heavy so that they can make effective progress in mathematics, knowing that their reading needs also need to be addressed separately?
And I think I would just add one piece, and that is it tends to have difficulty developing some of the fluency or automaticity with those math facts. And so when we have those rapid access questions or difficulties in that area, making those connections in letter and sound, that can also show up in that automaticity of those simple operations, 3 times 5 that we all have had to memorize over the year. We can conceptually understand it, but to move it from that conceptual understanding to automatically know it can be an area of struggle as well.
Okay, understood. All right, next. Thank you also for that. And next question: if cognitive assessments are not necessary, how do states using a pattern of strengths and weaknesses model address the lack of cognitive assessment scores? Let me know if you want me to read that again.
No, I'm good.
Okay.
I will address that, and Laura can also chime in. She and I have collaborated on some research that examines some of these issues. And it is the case that in the most recent and currently applicable special education law, the federal government provided some options for states around what are the requirements for identifying a specific learning disability. Of note, one of the things in that current law is that states can no longer mandate the use of an IQ test. And so that is something that you should not see, will not see in state regulations. However, and they also provided some other pathways, one that we talked about, which is utilizing progress data from a student's response to intervention, documenting if a student does or does not make progress. That is a very strong and reliable set of data to use for the purpose of identification. There are other data and information that are required. And certainly one pathway that I have seen used in a highly effective manner is instead of the cognitive assessment to use an additional academic achievement assessment to confirm that truly the student presents with low achievement in the area of reading across the board, regardless of the assessment that's conducted. I am aware that there are some who advocate utilizing data that is part of what's called a strengths or a processing strengths and weaknesses model. I have not yet found adequate support in the research literature for me to advocate that model. And thus, I would continue to say that cognitive assessment is indeed not necessary to identify a specific learning disability, including dyslexia. In states, however, where there is some requirement for a body of cognitive data to meet that strengths and weaknesses component, I guess my approach would be to use the minimum amount of testing necessary to meet the regulatory requirement, knowing that in and of itself, it is not going to be able to provide information by which we could inform instruction. Laura, do you want to add?
I think the only thing I would add is that some states are interpreting some of our phonemic awareness assessments as cognitive, in the sense of digging deep into that phonological aspect of processing. And so that certainly is something that is relevant and could be important in terms of your assessment.
Okay, thanks. Okay, next question. And folks, we've got a slew of questions in, so we're going to answer them in the order in which they were received, and we'll get through as many as we possibly can here before the top of the hour. Okay, next question is, does a child need to be diagnosed with dyslexia to be treated?
No, depending upon how one defines those words. Students should have access to high quality instruction and interventions if they are necessary. And so, if students are showing difficulty learning to read, they should be able to access reading supports. One way, right, is we have resources that are connected to our special education system. And so, if the child does meet those requirements, that may access different resources.
Excellent. Next question here. I'm an MTSS student support coordinator. I support teachers in helping them with helping their students. What's a good first approach for teachers when they suspect dyslexia? Would it be a screener?
My answer would be yes. If the school or district is not already conducting universal screening of all students in the area of reading, then I would say absolutely yes. Conduct some kind of screening that includes a measure of oral reading fluency, perhaps some additional subtests such as a pseudo-word decoding assessment, measures of phonemic awareness. Those are all going to provide you with really good information. If the district already does the screening and those results suggest that the student is at risk and the teacher suspects dyslexia, then the next step would be moving on to some of that diagnostic assessment where you dive in deeper to address figuring out why the student is struggling in terms of the areas where there are the greatest deficits. And then certainly providing intervention as quickly as possible is important, because the more quickly we act, the more likely the student can make effective progress. However, providing intervention does not preclude moving forward with a comprehensive evaluation. And it is very important to remember that providing some kind of tiered supports can never be a reason not to make an official referral for special education. If the evidence is there that a student might have the disability, there is a requirement that the district take action on that evidence and conduct a comprehensive evaluation.
Excellent. Laura, anything to add there?
Nope, let's go. We have so many questions. We should
Okay.
keep going a little bit.
We'll move it. Okay. This may be a tough question to answer here. What are a few of the best diagnostics to use?
Laura, you want to dive in?
So are we thinking, I think we're asking about diagnostic tests. And so I often have to say, are we asking the question about diagnostic for instruction? Are we trying to figure out what's the best instruction? And if that's the case, one thing to look at is what are the instructional interventions or programs that you have available to and are known of. Some of those have embedded assessments that are excellent. And that can really help you see what they're able to access and do. Or if we're talking about diagnostic for disability, which is a different question, there we might be looking at some of the standardized testments. For example, the CTOP is a gold standard in terms of the phonological processing components of dyslexia.
I concur.
Okay, fantastic. Here we have a specific question. I have a 5th grade student who was recently diagnosed as severe dyslexia. He gets reading and writing services, but I'm worried about his math. He's good with numbers and number sense. However, the word problems are very difficult. I'm worried about middle school. What can I do to help him before middle school?
I guess I'll try that one and see if Laura wants to add. I think that's a great example of where some strategy instruction in the area of math could be very helpful because the world, we can't take away all word problems in this child's world forever. So providing the student with some strategy instruction about what to do when encountering math problems that have words, thus making them more challenging for this child. And so there are some great strategies for keywords to identify to figure out the problem type, and or look for clarifying if certain accommodations need to be provided for a child in this situation so that they, for example, get additional time to work on word problems in mathematics, so they can be successful with the math problems that are there. We don't want to impede their access to becoming proficient in mathematics. So those are a couple of strategies that come to my mind.
And I think part of it is for, teachers, strong teachers of mathematics are really thinking about the visual representations that are involved in understanding of math concepts and how they're explaining those problems. And so making sure that the students understand those visual representations and how they might be there in words. Sometimes that maybe the problem can be written in represented in multiple ways to get to the same concept. And can build with that. Working in partners is another way that might be very helpful, right? That in terms of being able to talk through the problems with a partner who maybe did the reading for you, but you're able to then make sense of all the work or to confirm some of the reading that's there. All right, next question.
Next one. And this is somewhat related, but what accommodations are most beneficial for students with dyslexia?
I would
Laura, do you want to?
say it's access to grade level texts and figuring out what's the best way. The students, we are not helping students if we don't provide access to grade level texts and materials. And so we are in a digital world. And so ebooks, multimedia to get at some of the same content, thinking about the way that the materials can be shared, the content can be shared, would be my first and most important approach. And then I think the thing that's always, I guess, the worst thing that happens, or one worst thing, I can't say it's the worst thing, is to really think about our use of the red pen, and we thinking about what we're saying to children when they're writing and they're explaining their thoughts and various things. And do we give them scaffolds so maybe they can have an opportunity to speak about what they're talking about? And if they do have their ideas down on the paper, what are we looking for when we're looking at their writing? Not that we don't want their writing to improve, not that we don't want their spelling to improve. We certainly do. But we don't want to be discouraging.
I agree.
Okay, excellent. And we've got time for just one last question here. And it is, if a student struggles with fluency, but is competent with segmenting and blending, should dyslexia still be considered, or are there other possibilities?
My response to that would be to test the hypothesis that a fluency intervention could help support that. Because if basic decoding is intact, it may be that the student truly needs practice with words and reading them as connected text to build the fluency necessary to be a strong reader. For some students, that will work beautifully, and more or less we can rule out dyslexia. For other students, it won't work, and they will always engage in more labored reading, and therefore they will reach a plateau with fluency that is not on a par with what we would expect for the grade. But you could test the hypothesis through some fluency instruction first, and then determine if indeed that the profile supports dyslexia.
Alrighty, anything else to add on that last question?
No, I think it just summarizes back to what when we talk about the structured literacy, that one of those components is that we are cumulative and we're working towards mastery. And I tell my students in training, future teachers, why do we always write special education goals only to 80%? 80% is certainly not a rate of fluency. And so kind of stepping back to, what's happened. So they may have had systematic instruction, but just never reached a point of automaticity.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, on that note, we're going to wrap up our Q&A session. That's all the time that we have for questions, unfortunately. We really appreciate all the smart questions that folks were asking and all the attention that's been paid. So I have a few last housekeeping things here. First, we want to thank our audience and we want to thank our presenters for stimulating conversation today. And then also, we at Illuminate want to thank you for attending and for the work that you do each and every day with students. We're here to support you with tools like the FastBridge Assessment Solution, which includes screening tools that address all of the reading domains identified by the International Dyslexia Association, including phonological awareness and rapid automatic naming. If you'd like to see how the system works, please request a demo at illuminateed.com. And with that, that's all the time that we have for today. I want to thank everybody so much. Wish everybody a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you.